This is the story of King Gaarge and the dragon. It predates the story of Saint George and the dragon by 1,000 years. The story is set on White Horse Hill, and beneath White Horse Hill is Dragon Hill. Oh yes, and the narrator of the story is a young girl. So you just have to imagine that I'm a young girl. Okay? Here's the story. Everybody has a serpent inside, so they say, coiled at the base of the spine. I know it's true for me, because when I was 6, I woke one morning to find mine coiled on my pillow. It looked like a large earthworm, pinkish purple in colour. It seemed quite friendly for an earthworm, so we decided to keep it as a pet. That's my little sister, Winflith, which means beautiful and fair in our language, which she was, and me, Ethelinda, which means noble snake. My mother and father should never have called me that, or the tragedy which followed might never have happened. We chopped up leftover vegetables to feed my worm, and it grew very quickly. It was 12 inches long in no time, so we called it Draka, which means dragon in our language, because English dragons are really big worms, not like those Welsh dragons I've heard of with wings and fiery breath. Draka had no eyes or ears, so it couldn't see or hear us, yet it always sensed when someone was there, even whether it was either Winflith or me. One day Draka disappeared. There was just a round hole in the earth it must have made when it crawled off. Then it popped his head out of the soil and waved it about like it was saying, "Peepo." It just liked to burrow in the soil to moisten its skin. We loved to watch the way it stretched and contracted its body to slither along. We were amazed at how quickly it could go. We spent a lot of our spare time with Draka, Winflith and me, when we weren't herding the sheep or milking the cows or harvesting the crops. He loved it when I tickled the top of his head, waved his, it wasn't really a tail, bottom end with delight. When he became big enough, Draka let us ride on his back as he rushed across the fields. He seemed to enjoy it as much as Winflith and me. Then something terrible happened. The land for miles around was ruled by a warrior chieftain called Uther Pendragon. When he died, they decided to bury him near us, just below our hill fort, which had been one of his favourite places apparently. They built a great big burial mound, rocks of chalk covered by a thin layer of earth, and buried Uther in the middle of it, along with all the golden treasure he'd got as Pendragon. But that wasn't the terrible part. The terrible part was what happened to Draka. It seemed like he could smell the golden treasure. When the warriors arrived with Uther's body and his treasure, Draka's head came up, pointing in their direction. He stayed like that, alert and motionless for days. We knew he had no eyes or ears, and we thought he had no nose either. But he certainly had a nose for gold. He knew better than to go anywhere near the armed warriors as they dug the mound, but as soon as they were gone, he was off, slithering across the landscape, his body moving like waves on a duck pond, until he reached the mound. Draka just left us and took possession of the mound and its buried gold. Draca jealously guarded the mound and its gold. It was his gold now, and he allowed nobody near it. If anybody went near the mound, and some brave souls tried at first, he would lash them with his bottom end, and they would scurry away with bruised behinds. Nobody could get near, not even Winflith, no one but me. After all, he was my worm. No, maybe I was his. He still enjoyed me tickled his head, always did, right to the end. It seemed like he somehow took energy from the gold, which made him ravenously hungry. He took small creatures at first, mice and rats and hare, living around the foot of the mound. He had a way of opening his mouth very wide and taking the creature whole, then sucking it down into his crop so he could digest it slowly. That was when his breath began to smell with all that rotting flesh in his crop. As he grew larger and larger, he foraged further afield. That was when he started on our sheep. He would slither up to a grazing sheep, and before it knew what was happening, Draken opened its great maw and with a single gulp sucked it down into his crop. That was when we noticed he only took sheep, even one with long horns, never rams. His taste was for females of any species he fancied. The most terrible day was when he took Winflith. She was sitting on her little three-legged stool under the cow's udder, grinning fondly at me and contentedly milking the cow into a big wooden pail. When Draca slid up, she didn't take much notice. She was used to him being around. Only when he opened his great maw did she look alarmed. It happened so fast. One slurp and she disappeared. I rushed at him, beating him with the stick, but it was hopeless. She was already in his crop. One moment she was there, so beautiful and fair a maiden. The next she was gone. Then Draca slurped the milk from the pail, slid under the cow's udder and sucked her dry. I was so full of sadness and tears over losing my lovely Winflith, and so cross with Draca I wouldn't tickle his head for weeks. After that he had a taste for milk and maidens and would take no other. No maiden was safe from him. He could muscle his way across fields faster than any maid could run. Cows had no chance. Some maidens gave up being maidens to avoid becoming Draca's dinner. But it turned out he wasn't that choosy. Draca grew enormous on his diet of milk and maidens. I mean, really, really big. If you go there now, you can still see the deeply scored landscape where his great bulk slimed across it. When he wasn't foraging for his dinner, he lay coiled around what we came to call Draca's Dun, which means Dragon's Hill in your language. His vast tube of a body, seemingly drawing energy from his precious gold, and with all those rotting maidens and sour milk in his crop, the stench of his breath was so disgusting, and what with his bad behaviour as well, he was known far and wide as the loathly worm. The men decided something had to be done. Their solution was to draw lots every day to see which maiden was to be given to Draca for his dinner, along with 6 pails of milk. This put control back in our hands, they said. Typical. It was actually my father's idea. Did I mention he was the local chief in charge of the hill fort? So every day a maiden was chosen by lot. Her hands and feet were tied, and she was left with 6 pails of milk close to Draka's dun. Not too close on account of his abominable breath. One day it was my turn. It had to come, even if I was the chief's daughter. Only the day before I'd been on the mound tickling his head. I'd had to forgive him for gobbling up Winflith. It was just his nature after all. Now there I was, trussed up with 6 pails of milk and left there for his dinner. Then it all happened at once. As soon as he saw who'd been left for his dinner, he began to howl. He'd never howled before. I didn't know he could howl. He howled like he was suffering a terrible anguish. Well, I could see he was, howling and casting his great head from side to side. I could see he had a whole lot in his mind, wondering what to do, him being my worm and all. He was still howling when King Gaarge turned up, cantering slowly out the milky west, as my mother said. She always gave herself airs, being a chief's woman. He cantered up to me, got down from his horse, bit of an old nag, I thought. Told me to call him King Gaarge. Call me King Gaarge, he said, scourge of dragonkind. The dread news of your loathly worm has passed from mouth to mouth, over hill and vale to my abode far in the west. Now I am here, there is no more cause to fear. He'd get on well with my mother, I thought. He looked about as much of a scourge as a stick of celery, but he did have this big sword which he liked to brandish as he strode about, going on and on and on about all the dragons he had slain while I lay there trussed, with Draka howling and his noxious breath making the milk curdle. Finally, thank the goddess, he marched off up the mound, waving his sword. He had some pluck, I'll say that for him, clambering over the clammy coils. He'd never have got away with it if Draka had been himself. It'd have swallowed him whole and shat him back out probably, sword and all. But poor Draka, he was in such torment over being given his dinner. He didn't see what was coming. With 5 swift strokes, King Gaarge plunged his sword into each of Draka's 5 hearts, and it was all over for Draka. No contest. Afterwards, King Gaarge boasted about his great victory over the loathly worm to anybody who wanted to listen, which was everybody except me. Only I knew about Draka's inglorious end, and nobody was interested in my story. It wasn't racy enough. King Gaarge really got under my skin. He was so pompous, so conceited. He told them how he had leapt in to save the maiden, the chief's daughter even, as the dragon was about to devour her. How he had withstood the dragon's fiery breath. I couldn't see a scorch mark on him. Wielding his mighty sword, receiving many ferocious blows from the dragon's tail, I couldn't see a bruise on him. How, despite being a puny human against such a mighty foe, I agreed with him there, his experience as the scourge of dragonkind had prevailed, and he had struck the blow which brought the dread beast its demise. He even had the cheek to say that the dragon's venomous blood had seared the ground on the mound's summit, so nothing would ever grow there ever after. I knew it was just chalk showing through the thin soil. So that was the story which has been told ever since. King Gaarge and the Dragon on Dragon Hill. And I can tell you, it's pure myth. I hope, after listening to my story, you'll credit what really happened. After all, I was there. The worm was mine, and I was his.